For example, the issue of immigration has become a hotbed. People are increasingly angry about all that they associate with immigration. But a consideration that sheds light on this issue is one that all the problems that we associate with immigration stem not from the presence of people, but from the institutional arrangements in which people interact. Immigration of some types forces on the domestic population new requirements for public infrastructure. Schools must be built and funded. New public sector employees hired. The demands on the public purse grow. New immigrants can receive public assistance. They coalesce based on language and ethnicity and gain control of local governments through which they can coerce others. They have national voting interests, and their votes are up for grabs by parties representing special interests, which is to say both parties. Whereas people will suffer through incredible abuses when imposed by people who share their nationality, they will not tolerate the same from those whom they regard as aliens. The result is social and political upheaval. And what is the source? Not capitalism, not immigration as such. Rather, the core problem is the state, which enables some people to rob others on their own behalf. All other concerns are a distraction from this key issue. The best immigration reform is the one that would provide neither impediments towards work for anyone or subsidies of any sort. Eliminating the subsidies alone would help alleviate the resentment that comes with immigration. It would also stop the subsidies that cause people to immigrate for the wrong reasons. In any case, it is pointless and dangerous to pursue the method of using government power to round up illegals and throw them out, a power that is used to the detriment of commercial freedom, when the law still encourages demographic upheaval through subsidies and special rights. Let us recall that the federal government has no incentive to stabilize and control immigration in any sense that would be beneficial to American citizens. Whatever the government does, it ends up conspiring against private property owners. In areas of Arizona, where private lands bump up against the border, for example, the government actually restricts the ability of landowners to control trespassing. Let us ask a fundamental question. Can there be such a thing as overpopulation? The left seems to say that population growth is always a problem. The right seems to believe there can be no such thing as overpopulation. The libertarian Austrian view is a third position entirely. It argues that every population is optimal provided it reflects the free choices of individuals within a society in which production and exchange, the means of support for all people, is also permitted to reflect the choices of those people. A capitalistic society leaves the issue of population to the people. Under socialism, says Mises, there can be no toleration towards a laissez-faire population policy. Indeed, writes Mises, quote, without coercive regulation of the growth of population, a socialist community is inconceivable. A socialist community must be in a position to prevent the size of the population from mounting above or falling below certain definite limits. It must attempt to maintain the population always at that optimal number, which allows the maximum production per head. It is certain that even if a socialist community may bring free love, it can in no way bring free birth, unquote. Population only becomes a problem when government enters the picture. Here is where we need to address the second question with which I began. Why should these 300 million people be forced to live under the same central government? The independent Greek cities, out of which came Western civilization, had populations of 15,000 or so, quite a bit smaller than Auburn, Alabama. If we followed the Greek model, we'd not have one central government, but fully 20,000 small communities, each with political autonomy. They would compete for citizens and capital. Those that taxed and regulated their citizens and property would lose, and those who let people alone would gain. This would be economically, and they would be economically unviable on their own, and so they would be driven to permit free trade not only between the cities, but also with the rest of the world. This would not lead to isolationism, but rather the very opposite, a heightened economic and cultural internationalism, even as the structures of government would be close to home and easier to control. And as the politically independent Greeks were all still Greeks, we would all still be Americans. But the forces of competition would work to improve the governments under which we live and bring them more in line with the old liberal ideal. Now, if raising the idea of breaking the U.S. into 20,000 city-states sounds completely crazy to you, I look at it this way. If the new scientists can talk about how healthy the world would be if 6 billion people were zapped away by aliens, I can talk about the far more realistic and responsible vision of turning 50 United States into 20,000 free and disunited cities. Moreover, we should reflect on the reality that self-governing communities were precisely the experience of colonial America. The colonies traded with each other and with the rest of the world, to the extent the British let them. Citizens moved to locations based on the relative liberality of the laws. Our colonial ancestors were widely read. They learned from the experience of Rome that republican government can only coexist with liberty when both the territory and population size are small. Otherwise, they degenerate into despotic and unworkable schemes for central planning. The knowledge of this reality is what led to the revolt against their masters overseas. School kids are taught that the basis of the American Revolution was the desire of the colonies not to be ruled by a king. But this is a superficial view. It is also misleading to say that the colonists were driven to revolution by taxes or trade monopolies. These were both symptoms of a larger reality that had begun to dawn on them, namely that they were capable of self-government, and that therefore the empire was imposing a wholly unnecessary despotism on them. They didn't need to be ruled by some far-flung government on the other side of the world. They could rule themselves, and they had every right to assert that truth, which is what they did in the Declaration of Independence. The revolutionary generation spoke of the high debts of the British government, of its patronage and corruption, of the cruelty of its colonial administrators, of its arrogance and pride, of its departures from its historic principles of liberty. And all of these were seen as the inevitable consequence of empire, which is nothing more than the attempt to rule too many people over too large a territory under rules and laws that favor interest groups in league with the imperial state. The colonists spoke aggressively about liberating the colonies from the grip of the British Empire. They spoke of how a revolution against the empire would ultimately prove to be beneficial even to Britain itself, because it would help to return it to its first principles. They spoke of how the world would rejoice to see the British Empire humiliated in defeat. Mercy Otis Warren writes in her History of the Revolution that Americans felt a solidarity with many nations around the world who had been cruelly treated by the British Empire. Their identity began to be shaped around themselves as resistors to empire, and it even affected historiography at the time, as every group that had ever longed to throw off the yoke of the British came to have new luster in their eyes. Had the taxes and depredations occurred domestically, the level of tolerance would have been much higher, as is always the case. The decisive force in the revolution was that despotism was being posed at so remote a distance by a government that knew nothing and understood nothing about the distinctive American cultural and political identity that had been shaped over the previous 100 years and more. It was this that gave rise to such rhetoric as found in the sermon of Pastor Jonathan Mayhew in 1750, quote, "For a nation thus abused to arise unanimously and to resist their prince, even to the dethroning of him, is not criminal, but a reasonable way of vindicating their liberties and just rights. It is making use of the means, and the only means, which God has put into their power for mutual and self-defense, and it would be highly criminal in them not to make use of these means," unquote. It was the successful overthrowing of an empire that inspired the first code of government after the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation. The United States was to be an assembly of republics. We must understand that the word republic in those days was synonymous with small. The territory would be small. Monarchies could be larger, but even they had to divide as their populations grew. This view towards the size of republics was due to the influence of Montesquieu, who argued the point in great detail. In his view, large republics were necessarily corrupt and contained the seeds of their own destruction. Montesquieu was the favorite thinker of the intellectuals and activists who opposed the creation of the U.S. Constitution on precisely the grounds that such a big state would constitute an empire. Robert Yates, writing under the name Brutus, said against the Constitution, quote, "History furnishes no example of a free republic anything like the extent of the United States. The Grecian republics were of small extent. So also was that of the Romans. Both of them, it is true, in process of time, extended their conquest over large territories of country. And the consequence was that the character of their governments were changed from those of free governments to those of the most tyrannical that ever existed in the world, unquote. Patrick Henry, as usual, was more eloquent than anyone. Quote, if we admit this consolidated government, consolidated meaning centralized, it will be because we like a great, splendid one. Some way or other, we must be a great and mighty empire. We must have an army and a navy and a number of things. When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, that was the primary object. But now, sir,